Around 5 months ago, I tried to tackle a timeline placement theory for Breath of the Wild. In that video, I came to the conclusion that Breath of the Wild and its sequel will end up being placed in the child timeline. I also, for some bizarre reason, decided to use the geography of Hyrule as evidence, even though in every game the landscape constantly shifts. So that's why I'm remaking that video. This time I'm going to find more pieces of evidence that could be used to prove that Breath of the Wild is located in the child timeline. Anyway, if you end up enjoying this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. I would appreciate it a lot. But without any further delay, let's start this video. I'm going to start by looking at references to the child timeline on the Breath of the Wild map. This will be the weakest set of evidence that I will provide in this video, as there are references to nearly every single Zelda game in Breath of the Wild. However, I'll go through these anyway, as they do technically connect to the child timeline games. I will not go through any Majora's Mask or Four Swords Adventures references. Majora's Mask is not set in Hyrule, and it's only set in Termina, so any references to Majora's Mask are just that, references. And for Four Swords Adventures, I couldn't find any pieces of evidence at all, so we only have Twilight Princess references to work with here. Luckily, some of these references can be used as solid evidence that Breath of the Wild is in the child timeline. Firstly, let's look at some of the smaller references to Twilight Princess in the game. On Death Mountain you can find a pond called Dar Pond, which in itself is a reference to Darbus, who is also the second boss of Twilight Princess. Near Zora's domain there is another pond. This one is under the name Ralis, which is a reference to Prince Ralis. There is also a dam nearby that is named Rutala Dam, which is most definitely a reference to Queen Rutella from Twilight Princess. However, these were just small references to characters. They are not substantial enough to be called evidence. However, luckily, there are two locations in Breath of the Wild that can be used as evidence. Firstly, we have the Bridge of Hylia. In Twilight Princess, the Bridge of Hylia is a landmark that you travel across and see several times. Although it appears to have been changed and reconstructed, it's definitely supposed to be the same bridge. The next location is the Arbiter's Grounds. In both Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, the Arbiter's Grounds is found in the Gerudo Desert. In Twilight Princess it is a massive structure that is home to the 4th dungeon, while in Breath of the Wild it is merely a few broken structures scattered throughout the sand. Now that we have the map references out the way, let's go on to some story evidence. In Breath of the Wild, in the Subdued Memory cutscene, we can see Zelda reference 3 games: Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess. She states, "Skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight." Glowing Embers of Twilight is a clear reference to Twilight Princess, a game found in the child timeline. This can be used as substantial evidence that it's in the child timeline. However, that's where the explicit connections in this game end, as there are not many references to previous games in any of the cutscenes in Breath of the Wild. Instead, we're going to have to move away from Breath of the Wild, and we have to look at the overall plots of different Zelda games, and see if they would connect narratively. From this point on, this video will contain many spoilers from Zelda games, so turn away now if you do not wish to be spoiled about all the adult timeline games, Twilight Princess, and some Downfall timeline games. We'll start by looking into the ending of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. This entry is set after Ocarina of Time and is set in a flooded Hyrule. Towards the end of the game, the King of Hyrule obtains the Triforce and makes a wish. His wish was to wash away Hyrule and let the world move on. By doing this, the kingdom was completely destroyed. The Master Sword, Ganondorf, and the king were all left behind. The story of Hyrule had ended in this timeline, alongside Ganondorf's story. The following 2 games are set in different areas. Phantom Hourglass was set in the Sea of the Ocean King, and Spirit Tracks was set in New Hyrule. If Breath of the Wild was in the adult timeline, it would also damage the emotional impact of the ending, as everything that was sacrificed for the ending of the story would have been for nothing. Yes, I know the Rito and Koroks can be found in Breath of the Wild. However, Lynels can also be found in Breath of the Wild, and they never appeared in the adult timeline, so we can't use the presence of species and races as concrete evidence, which is why I will not be doing that in this video. Next, we have the Downfall timeline. Now in my opinion, Breath of the Wild also has a very high chance of being in this timeline. However, there are a couple of things that hold it back. The biggest factor that holds it back is the story of this timeline. The Downfall timeline is a what-if scenario that is formed if Link dies at the hands of Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time. Ganondorf steals the Triforce off Link and Zelda and makes a permanent transformation into Ganon. Ganon in this timeline is able to successfully destroy Hyrule. Yes, he completely destroys it. By the time we reach The Legend of Zelda, Hyrule is in its worst and most destroyed state. There are absolutely no settlements that can be found in this version of Hyrule, and people can be found living in caves. By the events of Adventure of Link, Hyrule is completely abandoned. Instead, small villages have crept up far away from the Old Kingdom. 100 years before Breath of the Wild, Hyrule was thriving, and the last damaging event took place over 10,000 years before. I find it hard to believe that the Hylians who left the Old Kingdom would ever return and rebuild everything in the same way again, the way it was, and act as though nothing happened. I personally believe a similar situation to the Wind Waker occurred. Everyone moved on to a new and better life and left the past behind. Yet again, it would be a step back in the story of Hyrule if Breath of the Wild is set in the Downfall timeline, as everything would be back to how it was. Notice how both the Adult and Downfall timelines share a similar ending. Both timelines showcase the end of Hyrule and the people moving on. The Child timeline doesn't have this type of ending. Instead, at this current moment in time, the only overarching story we have is about the legacy of the Hero of Time. Twilight Princess is about the descendant of the Hero of Time, the Hero of Twilight, learning the forgotten skills of his ancestor and fulfilling the Hero of Time's incomplete role of defeating Ganon, which in this timeline, the Hero of Time could never achieve. Hyrule in Twilight Princess does not get destroyed. In fact, it remains fairly intact for the whole game. Hyrule Castle Town is thriving, even when it's covered in twilight, and other settlements are managing just fine. Hyrule Castle does partially get destroyed, but that's literally just one location. Having Breath of the Wild sit at the end of the Child timeline makes sense, as Hyrule has only just recently been completely destroyed. Perhaps in Breath of the Wild 2 the damage could worsen and Hyrule could end up in an unrecoverable state. This would provide a suitable ending to this timeline. Now you may have noticed that I've ignored Four Swords Adventures during this section. This is because I believe its timeline placement is questionable and it's quite frankly in the wrong place. Let's move away from the stories of these games and let's look at the gameplay and art style patterns that are found in each timeline. Nintendo can obviously change these patterns at any time and they don't need to stick by them, so you're going to have to take this section with a pinch of salt, and this is a bit of a stretch. However, I think it might be interesting to look at these, as they could provide some reasonable evidence for the Child timeline placement. Every single Adult timeline game has one distinct art style, the cartoony, cel-shaded look. Every game in this timeline has this art style, and I personally believe that it's intentional. The art style gives the games in this timeline a certain charm and identity. Breath of the Wild does not have this art style, so if it was in the timeline, I believe it would stick out like a sore thumb. Breath of the Wild in the Downfall timeline would also not work. This is because I've noticed the Downfall timeline is made up entirely of the top-down Zelda games, which Breath of the Wild isn't, as I believe this gameplay style gives the Downfall timeline its identity. Breath of the Wild would fit perfectly in the Child timeline, however. All games excluding Four Swords Adventures are 3D and have a more realistic approach. Breath of the Wild would fit in alongside the Child timeline games as it shares these factors. However, at the end of the day, these are merely patterns, so they can easily change and are not solid evidence. Finally, let's look at Ganondorf. In the first Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, we got confirmation that Ganondorf exists in the world of Breath of the Wild. Of course, before this, we knew of Calamity Ganon, however that was more of a force of nature than an actual living, breathing thing. Ganondorf is an intelligent and scheming villain, very different to his malice creation. Ganondorf has only appeared in 3 games in his human form: Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. He doesn't actually appear in the Downfall timeline, as he technically doesn't exist anymore. After defeating the Hero of Time, Ganondorf took the full Triforce and made a permanent transformation into the Demon King Ganon. Due to this, I personally don't see Breath of the Wild taking place in this timeline, as Ganondorf is in the newest trailer, and in the Downfall timeline, he no longer exists. Furthermore, Breath of the Wild can't take place in the Adult timeline, because Ganondorf in that timeline is more than likely completely dead. At the end of the Wind Waker, he is turned to stone and is washed away alongside the Master Sword in his head. Earlier, I also brought up the fact that having him return would destroy the emotional impact of the ending to the Wind Waker. It's very likely that Breath of the Wild can't be in the Adult timeline. This now leaves the Child timeline. Although Ganondorf dies at the end of the game, there is evidence that the corpse we see in the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer is the same Ganondorf from Twilight Princess. Both Ganondorfs share the same head crown and both have some sort of wound on their chest. Furthermore, when the corpse comes back to life, it snaps its neck. This is very similar to Xant's neck crack that dealt the final blow to Ganondorf in Twilight Princess. I personally believe that these are too coincidental to be seen as coincidences. However, there is one thing that I believe can truly prove that Ganondorf in Twilight Princess is the same as the one in Breath of the Wild 2. Ganondorf in Twilight Princess appears to have acquired a new power. This power allows him to transform into a spectral-like form. The thing he becomes is very similar to Malice. Perhaps it's an early form of Malice transformation that he hasn't mastered yet. Malice is physical hatred. Perhaps Ganondorf's transformation in Twilight Princess was to do with Malice. Thanks to all of this evidence I've provided in today's video, I firmly believe that Breath of the Wild is a part of the child timeline. Before I finish off this video, I would like to quickly say that the lore in Breath of the Wild was formed in such a way so that it can fit in any timeline. This was confirmed when the Zelda man himself, Eiji Aonuma, stated, "We realised that people were enjoying imagining the story that emerged from the fragmentary imagery we were providing. If we defined a restricted timeline, then there would be a definitive story, and it would eliminate the room for imagination, which wouldn't be as fun." Why am I bringing this up? Well, you see, this statement shows that no theory on the timeline placement of this game is wrong, and it's up to the fans to decide where it should be placed. This theory at the end of the day is merely my own opinion, and is a part of my headcanon. If you believe it is a part of a different timeline, please tell me in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and perhaps even subscribe. I'm thinking of turning this into a 3-part series where I look at the possibility of Breath of the Wild being in all timelines, so any support would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.